So, just as in by way of introduction to this seminar today, it's kind of like a sequel to um, a similar seminar that we had on July 29th called Religion and Death, a Century Later, standing on the shoulders of Freud and Jung. I won't go into that, but we have a recording of those presentations if anyone's interested. But this topic, religion, Freud, and women, is a kind of natural sequel to that. And our speaker today, Jeffrey Rubin, wrote an article about this. And we hope that you've read that in advance. But if not, he's going to summarize some of his key ideas when he speaks in a few minutes. But now I want to turn this to Marc-Andre Cotton, who's our International Vice President, and who's going to introduce the speakers and facilitate the meeting. Marc-Andre?
Okay, thank you, Brian. Everyone can hear me? Is it okay?
Yes.
Okay, fine. I will like to introduce our main speaker today, Jeffrey Rubin, and then the two speakers that will speak after him. So Jeffrey practices psychoanalysis and psychoanalytically oriented psychotherapy in New York City and North Salem, New York. He teaches at the Object Relations Institute of New York, the American Institute of Psychoanalysis, and the C.G. Jung Institute of New York. He's author of 6 books: A Psychoanalysis for Our Time, The Good Life, Psychoanalytic Reflections on Love, Ethics, Creativity, and Spirituality, Psychotherapy and Buddhism Toward an Integration, The Art of Flourishing, A Guide to Mindfulness, Self-Care, and Love in a Chaotic World, and finally, Meditative Psychotherapy, A Marriage of East and West, and Practicing Meditative Psychotherapy. Dr. Rubin has taught at various psychoanalytic institutes and meditation and yoga centers, lectured around the country and abroad on psychoanalysis and on psychoanalysis and Buddhism meditation. Jeffrey is most interested in a pluralistic psychoanalysis that respects the genuine insights and practices from each analytic tradition and draws on best that has been taught and said from all psychoanalytic schools, as well as history, art, literature, anthropology, and anything that illuminates the human condition. His pioneering approach to therapy was featured in the New York Times Magazine. So he'll have 15 full minutes to speak to us, and then we'll have 10 minutes with Charlotte Schwartz, who is a psychoanalyst in private practice in the Chicago area and has taught pediatrics and social work at New York Medical College, Smith College School for Social Work, and NYU School of Social Work. She's the author of Sex, Society, and Relationships, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, and the mythology surrounding Freud and Klein, Implications for Psychoanalysis. Then we'll have 10 minutes for respondent Trevor Peterson, PhD, who is a psychoanalytic counselor in private practice in Laramie, Wyoming. He's author of The Economics of Libido, Psychic Bisexuality, the Superego, and the Centrality of the Oedipus Complex, published by Routledge in 2015, and Psychoanalysis and Hidden Narrative in the film Reading the Symptoms, also published by Routledge. Dr. Peterson is on the editorial board of the International Journal of Controversial Discussions. His books, The Economics of Libido, won the Godiva Award for Best Book, and his Narcissism, Heroism, Perfection and Death Towards a Structural Psychoanalysis was nominated for Best Article. So now I leave the floor to Jeffrey for 15 minutes. Thank you very much, Jeffrey.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. If it wasn't for Brian, we wouldn't be having this discussion today. Brian had read the paper and in an enormously generous gesture said to me, I think this would be a decent paper for discussion. So Brian, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you for the group within the International Psychohistorical Association, Faith, Religion, and Social Justice for inviting me. Thank you, Ina. As always, none of this would happen without your great efforts on explicit and implicit levels. Thank you, Charlotte, Trevor, Teresa, and Gabriella for taking the time to read and reflect on what I know at moments may have been a dense paper. And thank you all in the audience for being here today. There are many, many other things you could have done. And I'm touched that you're here to explore, for all of us to explore together, Freud, women, and gender. Okay. This is an important topic. To me, it's also not an easy one. It's tough because of the three words in the title: religion, Freud, women. Think about it: religion, Freud, women. I think these terms arouse a lot of passion. And when there's passion, there's devotion, there's commitment, there's sometimes disillusionment, there's sometimes clinging in the Buddhist sense, there's sometimes moralizing, there's sometimes attacking, and so forth. You get the picture. So we have our hands full in a certain sort of way today. We have an extremely important topic, and we have one that's tricky. It's just really tricky. So just some thoughts about that. I hope today that you all bring all of your passions to this. And it would be great if we could consider something that Kohut wrote about that I don't think is cited that much. He used the phrase empathic scholarship. And it struck me years ago that we're all don't have that hard a time when we're trying to empathize with, it could be a historical phenomena, it could be a client patient. It's not impossible to empathize with the foreign worlds of such people. Someone believes in reincarnation, a patient, you don't. Someone believes in astrology, you don't. We try to understand them. For the empathic part of this is from their point of view, not our point of view. We're not there to judge, we're there to understand. But something different seems to happen when it's colleagues. When, Winnicott infamously presented a seminal paper, I think it was 52, 53-ish, New York Psychoanalytic. He was just really beaten down badly. I actually met someone, a former supervisor of mine was there. And it was just horrible. They just beat him up, and Winnicott went back to his hotel room and he had a heart attack. I don't know if it was causative, correlative, one doesn't know. Rycroft describes the same thing in the British Psychoanalytic Society. He walked out because he was just sick of the vitriol and the acrimony and all that. So I think there's some lacuna that happens when we start to talk about theories and practices and people outside of the office. We seem to drop some of that, a great discovery of the empathic method. So I'd like to suggest today that we fight to keep that empathic spirit. And so in that spirit, I'd like to suggest we try to listen to what everyone says, not listen for confirmation of our own theories. When I supervise therapists, I make this distinction. When we listen to, we really have a kind of innocent mind, and we're open to what's foreign and surprising and outside our own favorite paradigms. When we listen for, it's just bad science. We're not really trying to falsify. We're just trying to look to confirm what we already know. So I want to say, let's stretch ourselves. Let's try to listen to each other. And this isn't easy because it's emotionally challenging. But when we don't know what we'll discover, we don't know what we find, we can find something we don't know. In Zen, this is called beginner's mind. In the mind of the expert, Suzuki Roshi writes, in the mind of the expert, possibilities are few. In the mind of the beginner, possibilities are endless. And then he says, always keep beginner's mind. So I want to put in a vote that we all try to have beginner's mind as we engage this really important but fraught topic of Freud, religion, and women. Okay. I'm not going to be able to go through my whole paper, but I'm just going to say just sort of some things to set the table a little bit. So religion's really important in our world, obviously. Religion is not one thing. It's more correct to really write religions, not religion. It's many things. And if you really think about it from a kind of open perspective, it's fostered the highest kind of ethical ideals. Think of Buddha, think of Christ, think of the underpinnings of the American Civil Rights Movement, which were incredibly devout Christian people. So there's that in the history of religion. And obviously, religion is also a story of fueling oppression, legitimizing fundamentalism, et cetera, et cetera. So religion is Janus-faced. It really, really, really is. Now, religion tends to enjoy a problematic position in psychoanalysis. It tends to have been marginalized, pathologized, reduced since Freud's account of religion and childhood fears and compensations, which I love. I think if we look honestly, let's say Future of an Illusion, Freud's 27 work, it still holds up as shedding important light on religion. Whether it sheds the total light, that's something we'll try to get into today. But it was deeply important, and I just want to sort of clarify maybe potential misunderstandings. It's still terribly important, I think, to us and to me. So in Religion, Freud, and Women, what I'm trying to do is simply examine a hidden source of Freud's view of religion, namely what I feel is his problematic relationship with his mother. And what I try to do is draw on revisionist psychobiographical material about Freud's relationship to his mother to attempt to demonstrate that he unconsciously linked religion and the maternal, and that his fears of the maternal may have led to his rejection of religion. Okay. In Freud and His Followers, 1971, the historian Paul Roazin wrote that Freud was the victim of a, quote, obscure deprivation. In Freud, A Life for Our Time, the historian Peter Gay wrote, Peter Gay speaks of Freud's evasion of his complicated feelings about Amelia Freud, Freud's mom. The available portrait of Freud's mother are unflattering. Abraham emphasizes her, quote, predatory, emotionally consuming nature. Freud's mother, according to Abraham, was possessive and demanding. Roazin, the historian, describes her as, quote, domineering and imperious. Quote, many in the family suffered from her authoritarian character. Her middle daughter, Dolphy, for example, was not allowed to have a life of her own. Freud's niece, Judith Bernays Heller, described Freud's mother, her maternal grandmother, as a tyrant and a selfish one. Freud's list of the 10 good books, 10 good books, describe mother figures in strikingly similar ways. As aggressive, non-giving figures, cold, harsh, and domineering, as Robert Holt notes. Freud, as we know, was his mother's firstborn and undisputed favorite. His mother referred to him as mein goldener Ziggy. Freud described his relationship with his mother in wonderful terms, idealized terms, I would argue. The relationship between mother and son is, and I quote, this is Freud, the relationship between mother and son is altogether, I want these words to really resonate, altogether the most perfect, the most free from ambivalence of all human relationships. This is 1933, page 133. Now, Freud, above all, taught us to both question such statements and to search for what they might hide and disavow. And I want to argue that Freud's idealized depiction of the mother-son relationship reflects a defensive process that may conceal her negative and disappointing qualities, and thus protect Freud and his mom from the anguish of confronting the shattering truth about their relationship. Okay, how are we doing with time here? Okay. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Now, I feel that Freud hides more of this struggle with his mom in his account of female development. This is on page 342 of my article. I'm going to quote. Discussing the girl's transition from the pre-Oedipal phallic stage to the Oedipal period when the powerful attachment to the mother ends, Freud, 1933, wrote, the turning away from the mother is accompanied by hostility. The attachment to the mother ends in hate. A hate of that kind may become very striking and last all through life. It may be carefully overcompensated later on. As a rule, one part of it is overcome while another part persists. The reproaches against the mother, according to Freud, include she gave the child too little milk, which is experienced as lack of love, and she gave birth to other siblings. And this is Freud's quote. But what the child grudges the unwanted intruder and rival is not only the suckling, but all the other signs of maternal care. It feels that it has been dethroned, despoiled, prejudiced in its own right. I'm going to skip ahead. Nor does it make much difference if the child happens to remain the mother's preferred favorite. The references to the mother's preferred favorite, think again, mein goldener Ziggy, who is dethroned, despoiled, and prejudiced in his own right by the repeated births of new siblings, the carefully overcompensated repressed hostility, the self-blame encoded in the description of the child's immoderate and excessive claims for love, all to me suggest that Freud's description of female development is in fact a depiction of a certain negative aspect of his own experience with his mother. In these descriptions of female development are embedded unconscious derivatives of Freud's narcissistic rage at his faithless mother, who traumatically dethroned and despoiled him, supposedly her preferred favorite, by giving birth to 7 siblings in 10 years. Let me just see the time. I think I have 2 minutes. Okay. So I'm not going to be able to go through most of the argument. It's an intricate argument, sort of piece by piece. But what I look at is all sorts of different parts of theoretical writings, interview with colleagues at the same time, my own reactions in the material to suggest that Freud had very ambivalent relationships with his mother. And one could sort of, a low-hanging fruit is to say, well, Jeffrey's kind of setting up a straw man, and Jeffrey's not really looking at what Freud wrote about religion, where he talked about, you know, the father that protects the child against helplessness. But again, I would encourage us to be more Freudian than we might want to be, even if we feel we're Freudian, in that not just to take his conscious account at face value, but actually look at the facts. His father, as we all know, was actually a man that he saw as weak, and he was embarrassed by. Someone knocked his hat off and was anti-Semitic on the street. He's hardly the menacing figure of this sort of dangerous God. So, and if you look at the essay on nature, Goethe's On Nature, I talk about this later in the essay for those who have read it. And if you haven't, the argument will all make sense, and the discussion today, if you get a chance to read the paper, you know, at your leisure. But in Nature, I think Freud puts how he feels about mother. And when he read Goethe's essay on nature, which talks about the devouring, dangerous mother, nature as mother, that's when he decided to immediately go to medical school. And I'm arguing that he wanted to figure out nature's secrets, what had happened with my mother. And so when Freud says, what do women want? I think he's really saying, what did mother do to me? What happened here? I am not trying to say that Freud hated all women or irrationally walked around with anger. I'm trying to look at a neglected, because the biographies focused on Oedipal stuff and father and later development. I'm trying to take the lead of more contemporary people that are also looking at early parent relationships. Winnicott said there's no such thing as an infant, there's only an infant, you know, mother-father dyad. I'm trying to look at that, to look at hidden dimensions, to illuminate one source of Freud's reaction to religion, not all sources. I said very clearly in the paper, there are about 5 other reasons Freud questioned religion, but one source, I think, is that Freud links religion and the maternal was dangerous. Because this is in the experience, the interchange in Civilization and Discontents with Roman Roland, who said, Freud, you've neglected the higher sources of religion, this cosmic, you know, experience of oneness with the universe. And Freud said, I can't relate. I didn't have that experience. But I think that Freud was very, very, very frightened about that. I want to really respect the time, because there's so many people that are going to speak. So I think I'll end it now. We can get into the details of this later further if you want, but thank you.
Okay, thank you. You still have 1 minute, Jeffrey.
Oh, I still have 1 minute. Okay. Okay. So what I do is look at display. I look at Freud's views of parents. He said parents are narcissistic. Well, some of you, if not all of you, have been parents. Let's say some of you have been parents. One of the things you quickly learn is it's the opposite of your narcissistic. It's very self-denying at moments. So Freud has strange comments that I read over for years. I read past them for years because I think he's a genius and he's a visionary. But I started I started being more Freudian, frankly. I started taking very seriously what he was saying and what he was not saying. So when he says the mother-son relationship is, you know, the only conflict-free realm, I immediately said to myself, what conflict does he not want us to look at and him to look at? So I look in other places, his views of parenting. He says women have less justice. They don't have less justice. I think he was angry at his mother for the injustice of how she treated him. So it's a kind of argument built up slowly with a bunch of details.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey, for your presentation. So I'll give the word to Charlotte. Charlotte, you have 10 minutes to respond. You have to unmute yourself. Oh, we can't hear
We
you
can't
yet.
hear you.
How about now?
Great.
Perfect. Thank you,
Okay.
Charlotte.
Very good. Okay. I want to thank you, Brian and Mark, for this conference and for all who participated in it. It's quite an interesting one. Dr. Rubin has presented an erudite and interesting paper. On Freud, religion, and women. His references are extensive and ideas are indeed provocative. Unfortunately, I am unable to agree with him regarding his basic premise that Freud's dismissal of religion and supposedly very negative attitude regarding religious beliefs were due to his unconscious and unresolved anger at his mother, Amelia. As referenced by Dr. Rubin, Freud was the favorite, the preferred sibling of 8 children, of a dominating, imperious, and narcissistic mother. His father was passive and kind, but ineffectual. Thus, Freud's failure to consciously recognize his hatred and ambivalence toward her led to his displacement and projections of these feelings and ideation that subsequently provided the foundation for his negative conceptualizations regarding religion and those who profess religious ideology. Rubin, in his many reference also postulated this theory in a seemingly convincing argument that I consider requires a refutation. Firstly, regarding psychoanalytic methodology. To analyze Freud from his writings and from pieces of family history that is not supported by Freud on the couch is a dangerous use of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis has a twofold purpose, one of treatment of the individual, and secondly, provides a theory of mental construction and mental functioning, a scientific theory of psychology of the mind. Do we really analyze painters, writers, musicians by their works of art? Do we analyze psychoanalysts based on their theoretical writings? Yet, if we accept the premise that we can justly analyze Freud based on his many theoretical premises and various autobiographical writings, I would hypothesize that his supposedly negative affects and ambivalence towards his mother, as suggested by Dr. Rubin, could best be reflected in his theories on the Oedipus complex and homosexuality. The ineffective father could best explain Freud's rejection of God the Father, to whom religions refer to and pray to, but who also is for Freud an ineffectual father figure. Does the shift from a mother god to multiple gods, males and females, to finally a primarily universal male god, reflect the increased power of the male, and thus again Freud's disappointment in his weak and supposedly ineffectual father, with whom he is disappointed? Would this not be a better characterization of Freud's criticism of God and religion, a projection of his disappointment in his father? Let us now look at how Freud delineates God in The Future of an Illusion. Freud initially asks the question of why religion, why God? His answers do not resound as an angry man or one of projected defenses. He writes that religion arose as a protective and emotional and intellectual defense against, quote, the crushingly superior force of nature, end of quote. And quote again, that religious ideas have arisen from the same need as have all the other achievements of civilization. End of quote. Further, as to the reality value of most religions' precepts, he stated, quote, we cannot judge that just as they cannot be proved, so they cannot be refuted. We still know too little to make a critical approach to them. And psychoanalysis, according to Freud, is the method of research, and thus he looked at religion from the perspective of scientific inquiry. Freud appreciatively can say, quote, religion has clearly performed great services for human civilization. It has contributed much toward the taming of the asocial instincts. Does this sound like an angry man who has projected his unconscious anger towards his mother onto religion? Let us now go back in time to totem and taboo and hear what Freud postulated regarding religion. Religion has its historical origins in the early history of totems and taboos. Both religion and totems owe their primary origin to mankind's guilt over the killing of the primal father. The father of the first hordes of humans, particularly for the sons, was both a love object and an object of hatred and aggression. That the sons as a horde killed the father and then regretted the deed, as they then lost a benefactor and protector, gave rise to universal guilt. Thus, the establishment of God, the protector, was a palliative measure to assuage their guilt and provide the lost protector. Further, as we examine his thinking in Moses and monotheism, we observe a most sensitive perusal of the development of religious thought. Freud stated, quote, there is an element of grandeur about everything to do with the origin of religion. The development of religious thought in Freud's conceptualizations of God as the Oedipal Father stands as an important contribution to an understanding of God, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Ghost, and most other gods. If we turn to a Jewish religious leader, Rabbi Eli Counselor, we observe in his writings that God is frequently referred to as God our Father, and the Israelites spoken of as God's children. And is this not in the Jewish Torah? What is this meaning of calling God our Father? Is it not the cry and the desire to be protected by God as a paternal figure? God encompasses both mercy and comfort. Terms that are both associated with God's love and forgiveness. That's for Freud to speak of religion as a cry for childhood comforts and protection has roots in the history of mankind's early development and religious constructs. It is not a demeaning concept to reference our childhood needs and desires in religious beliefs.
Charlotte, you have 1 minute left.
Yeah, I'm almost done. But rather provides a phylogenetic understanding of religion. A quick note to Freud's feelings about women. His many colleagues were women. His marriage was good. He was close to his daughter, Anna. Does this sound like a man unconsciously angry at women? And what shall we say about his statement in the new introductory lectures that, quote, one gets the impression that little girls are more intelligent than boys of the same age and form stronger object effects, end of quote. An unconscious angry man? No, a self-analyzed, brilliant man.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So we're right on time, and I'll give the floor to Trevor. If you may proceed, thanks very much.
Am I good? Could you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'd just like to thank Brian for inviting me to this and Dr. Rubin for giving us this good paper to talk about. I agree with Dr. Rubin that some of Freud's statements about women are puzzling and are likely a product of his own projections of unconscious material. However, Rubin's next step to align the material with religion and ultimately say both science and religion are on the same level isn't quite as persuasive. Rubin asks if Freud strived to, quote, destroy and live without illusions, particularly the illusions of God and kindly nature, relate in any way to, quote, puncturing the mystifications and illusions of his mother. Firstly, I think he's equivocating two types of illusion. As I see it, Goethe's remarks on nature that Rubin uses to make the connection would speak to illusion in the sense of camouflage, mimicry, and all the ways in which animals may hide from prey or lure it in. This level of illusion is still expressed in humans on the level of the repetition compulsion. For example, the narcissist often has superficial charm and can make a powerful impression from distance to lure in his codependents. But after this illusion works, he'll begin to denigrate them, isolate them from others, and ultimately traumatize and discard them. This illusion is the wolf in sheep's clothing. The illusion of religion, like any ideology, is to posit some meaning behind nature, some essence of the world. There's an intelligible contrast between just regular striving for happiness, finding love, success in the world, versus orienting towards meaning or doing things out of a sense of duty or higher purpose. In Freud's 1911 paper on Schreber, he seems to indicate that his connection, the connection to the latter informed the father is importing a mythological binary, such as we see in the idea of Mother Earth and Father Sky. However, I want to be clear that I don't know if the place of what I'm calling the level of ideology must be symbolized by the father. I have not encountered any analytic writing that examines this issue in a way that shows me the chain of logic and clinical evidence that could count as knowledge either. This is an important point that I'll return to later. Rubin's material for Freud being exploited by his mother, to my mind, is best characterized as a phallic-mother relationship. As Joyce McDougall best describes it, the phallic mother seduces the child to see both her and himself as special and denigrates the father's image. The unhappiness of Freud's mother with living in a simple apartment with 7 children or 8 children very likely made his father the target of such denigration and set up this phallic maternal relation. It's also illustrated in Freud's ambition and his own self-confidence. In my own work, I have argued that the phallic mother sets up what we could call a mentor-protege repetition compulsion, in which the child looks for future authority figures and is driven to set up a close relationship with them like he did with the mother. Additionally, the child can also reverse this to become a mentor himself and seek proteges. This repetition is very evident in Freud's life. He sets up Fleet and Breuer as mentors, who he wanted to impress with all his nascent thoughts on psychoanalysis. But then Freud ultimately reversed this pattern with Jung, Rank, and others who approached him as proteges. I'm sure Freud felt exploited and betrayed by Jung and Rank and the rest, and that Fleece did too after Freud angrily stopped their intimate correspondence. For Rubin to claim that religion would fall into this pattern would mean that Freud would first have to look upon religion as ideal and special, and then you'd have to feel that it misled him or was not the perfect thing he thought it was. I don't see any evidence for this in any of his writings on religion. Moreover, for it to be hated as the bad exploiting mother, like Freud's writings don't put forward religion in this way, like we see Nietzsche in his writings in the Antichrist, Christopher Hitchens, who calls himself an anti-theist. So in all these other examples, we can see hate, we can see things like fear. I just don't get that from reading Freud's texts. Rubin ultimately ignores Freud's explicit statements on religion being connected to the father in order to make the case that Freud was scared of the power of religion as he was scared of the power of the treacherous, devouring mother. However, it seems to me that Rubin should just have followed Freud at his word to say that he might have wrongly criticized religion just as he criticized his own father for being weak and decrepit and lacking courage. In my reading, this better captures the sensibility that we see in Freud's writing on the subject. Rubin's later remarks relativize science to be on equal footing with religion. He claims that, quote, Freud worships science, the religion of empirical verification, as the new divinity, and that this deeply, quote, deeply limits psychoanalytic thinking and reduces and neglects other humanistic paths to knowing, such as art and religion. I would counter this with the idea that there's no thinking until something is scientific or set up as something that could become a testable hypothesis. For example, Freud wrote about destroying illusions in One of the Difficulties of Psychoanalysis in 1920. There, he put forward the idea of the collective narcissism of civilization and that it has been wounded 3 times. He touts Copernicus as the first to destroy the narcissistic illusion that the Earth is the center of the universe, then Darwin showing that humans are part of the evolutionary process and therefore not different than the animals, but only a form of them. He lastly brings in psychoanalysis and gives the famous quote that the ego is not master in its own house. When Copernicus discovered that astronomical calculations could only work when the Earth was not taken to be the center of the solar system, it is easy to see that the previous belief didn't come from thinking. It came from fantasy, and as Freud called it, the narcissistic illusion that the Earth must be important, the most important thing to God, because we humans, who are supposed to be made in his image, were the crown of creation. The fantasy of one's importance to God and the placement of the home of the humans in the center of his universe is closer to replaying a memory of the mother at the crib, looking down at her children, than anything like systematic thought whatsoever. The value of the scientific stance is that where one has no experiment that can be reproduced by others, or at least systematic thought that can be put into an experiment, one does not claim knowledge. Of course, Freud universalized from particular cases and made some mistakes. He didn't follow his ideal here. But the value of science is that there's been many criticisms of Freud work, and any psychoanalyst today who claim that all women have a deficient sense of justice, or that something is just merely true because Freud said it, this wouldn't be taken as a serious claim to knowledge. Before I would take Rubin seriously on the idea that science is no better than religion and that it just involves another faith or worship, I very much want him to be open and honest about his religion and why, out of all the religions that have existed on Earth, he knows his to be the true one. How does he know that Mormonism isn't the true religion, or Protestant Christianity, or Hinduism, or Scientology? What if the world got it wrong and Zeus and his polytheistic family is the true religion? I would like to hear his thinking here on why some religions can be taken seriously, but others can't. And just because I notice I have a minute or 2 left, I'll just say that, you know, when we have things like, say, Freud uses, as we know, the Oedipus myth from Greek mythology. I know I would say like that you can take these myths and that there's things that you can derive from them. I wouldn't say that there's thinking in the myth. I wouldn't say that people in Greek society know about Freud's ideas on the Oedipus complex and what this means from childhood development. They're sharing these fantasies with each other. And later on, because Freud discovered a way of working with fantasy, understanding where fantasy is derived from, then we can start to bring knowledge to a myth. But otherwise, the symbolism, these things, like they can be powerful. You could have powerful experiences with them, and you could have some kind of personal intuition. But I'll just say, like on a personal note, for me, like there's nothing more annoying than talking to a colleague, and often like some Jungians I've talked to, where they just have this implicit sense of like, I know this myth means X. I know what this stands for. But if you ask them to explain it to you, to tell you like, how did you derive that interpretation? Like, why did it mean this? Like they don't have anything to give you. There's no thinking that can be shared, that can be kind of
1 minute left.
Given to you so that you can take your own logic, your own clinical experience, your own sense of how this theory works, and then take it somewhere. Instead, you just kind of have this appeal, you know, to their own intuition, their own sense of knowing, their own personal Jesus, and it's not satisfying. It's not thought. It's not something that's collaborative. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Peterson. So we are right on time to give back the word to Jeffrey. You have 5 minutes to respond if you wish, and then we'll have a general discussion.
Okay. This isn't going to be easy because there are 2 papers, but I'm going to do my best. Okay. First of all, thank you, Charlotte and Trevor, for reading the paper, taking it seriously. Okay. Charlotte, to me, ironically, is not Freudian enough. I don't mean this disrespectfully, Charlotte. I mean it playfully. She writes, and I quote, that psychoanalysis has a twofold purpose, one of treatment of the individual and a theory of mental construction and mental functioning. End of quote. I totally agree. Freud wrote, though, that there's a third purpose. And the third purpose is applied. So Freud saw psychoanalysis as three things, not two. And in fact, he did three things because he wrote psychobiographies. So the very thing that you were saying, how can we do it? Freud did it. He wrote a psychobiography of Leonardo, and he put, apparently, I think somebody told me this recently, maybe Brian, he put his name to Bullock's psychobiography of Woodrow Wilson. I'm not sure if Freud actually wrote it, but he definitely wrote Leonardo. Okay. So Freud and others have written, I think what's underneath this is a nervousness that we could reduce, and I think Trevor may have this too. Yeah, Trevor had it in his comments about Copernicus and Darwin. The idea of a good psychobiography is not a pathography, which critics of analysis have used that word. It's not a pathography where we pathologize and reduce the person. That's not what we're talking about. But that doesn't mean one can't write an illuminating psychobiography where one illuminates some of the subjective roots of the theory, and then it ununiversalizes sometimes the scope of the theory. Charlotte repeatedly cites instances seemingly showing and proving Freud was not angry towards women. That's a misunderstanding of what I wrote and is frankly not relevant to my conclusions. Freud explicitly pushed away conflictual feelings towards his mother. That's what I'm talking about, not his feelings about women, female colleagues, any of that. Okay. Central to Freud's critique of Judeo-Christian traditions, religion was the way God was a powerful father figure who allayed our feelings of childlike helplessness. Charlotte reduces my argument to Freud is, and I quote, an angry man who has projected his unconscious anger towards his mother onto religion. That's not what I actually said, nor is it actually what I believe. What I'm trying to say is one possible source of his critique of religion is his feelings about his mother that link with the maternal, but not that he's running around and that he's angry and that he's throwing out religion. He says very explicitly, religion is an illusion, and he says that doesn't mean it's not true. It's not about the truth value of that. Charlotte writes, it's not a demeaning concept to reference our childhood needs and desires in religious beliefs, but rather provides a phylogenic understanding of religion. That's not what I'm writing or believing either. I'm not saying Freud is demeaning religion. I'm saying he just didn't consider all of it. Okay. I want to shift to Trevor. I'm not going to have enough time. Trevor writes that I wish to bring about the, quote, reconciliation of psychoanalysis with religion. I'm just seeking a respectful dialogue, not a reconciliation. Trevor writes, Rubin ignores Freud's explicit statements on religion being connected to the father in order to make the case that Freud was scared of the power of religion as he was scared of his treacherous, devouring mother. Rubin should have followed Freud at his word. I think perhaps Trevor is not, again, being psychoanalytic and Freudian enough. He's reacting to Freud's conscious statement. I'm interested in Freud's conscious statement, but Freud's taught me enough to know that we need to look for what's not said, not just what's said. Okay. Freud taught us to be alert to what's not said. All right. Trevor writes, before I take Rubin seriously on the idea that science is no better than religion and that it just involves another faith or worship, and that why out of all the religions that have existed on earth that he knows his to be the true one, I want to suggest that's a misunderstanding of what I wrote in three ways. Number one, I didn't say that science is no better than religion and that it just involves faith or worship. I wrote that they're both valuable, science and religion, to human beings and need to be understood and respected. I'm saying religion and science have those elements sometimes of faith and worship, not that that's all they have. Number two, I didn't present my religion, and I don't believe what I believe about religion or psychoanalysis or anything else is the, quote, true one. I don't even know what that means, the true one, but that wasn't the purpose of my paper. Number 3, I didn't present a religion or my religion. I wrote about Freud and psychoanalysis's relation to religion and what light each could potentially shed on the other.
Okay, Jeffrey is.
Okay.
You
Can I
have the
say
last,
one more?
last,
Can I say
yes,
one
of
more?
course, of course.
Okay.
Yes, of course.
Okay. I think underneath all this is the following. I think science is treated by some as the royal road to truth. The interesting thing that I've never seen anyone talk about is science, the sort of the discipline that values empirical validation. Where has that claim ever been empirically validated? I don't think it has. Science is an incredibly invaluable way of knowing, but it's not the only way of knowing. Art, religion, anthropology, or other ways and paths, none are superior to me. All are deeply important. I want a world of Einstein and all the women and men who did and do science. I also want a world of poets and painters and Sophocles and Shakespeare and Toni Morrison. So it's not a battle in my mind between religion and science, Trevor. It's I want a more respectful dialogue.
Okay, thanks very much, Jeffrey. Thanks very much. So we'll have a general discussion now for 25 minutes. So I'll proceed for the second hour of our conference. We'll have 2 more respondents. But before that, I would like to briefly present our working group on faith, psychology, and social justice. We've been working for more than 2 years now on a monthly basis. So we have Constance Benson, Doris Leiter, Gabriela Gusita, who will talk today, Charles Gorgi, Brian, and Kenneth Rasmussen, and myself. And we virtually meet each month to discuss topics, articles that some of us have written, and also organize small conferences that, like the one that took place in July, or of course this one we are presenting to you now. And I inform you that there are other working groups in the IPHA that maybe you would like to join. Whatever you may want, here are the 2 respondents that will have 10 minutes each. That is, first of all, we have Gabriela. Gabriela Gusita is a psychologist and psychotherapist specializing in relational psychoanalytic psychotherapy. She is a regular member of the Association of Greek Psychologists and the International Association of Relational Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy, and a collaborator of Alpha Bank, where she provides psychotherapeutic services to employees of the organization. For the last 8 years, she has maintained a private office as a psychologist in the Paleo-Faliro region. She works with people who experiences depression, anxiety, addiction, unmanageable anger, suicidal behavior, compulsive ideology, as well as difficulty with relationships, self-knowledge, existential issues, and professional orientation. Gabriela has authored articles and conference presentations on these and other clinical topics. And as I told you, she is part of our working group on religion. And then we have 10 minutes for Teresa Ailo, PhD, which is a graduate of the Juilliard School, Silverman Hunter College School of Social Work, and NYU Silver PhD programs. She has been a tenured associate professor of social work at the NYU Silver School of Social Work, where she taught in the PhD and DSW programs. She writes on applied psychoanalytical theories, narrative, oral history, and psychohistory. Dr. Ailo received the much coveted NYU Distinguished Teaching Award in 2000 and was elected to the National Academies of Practice as Distinguished Practitioner and Scholar. Among other psychoanalytic institutes, she has taught in the NIP Institute for the Psychotherapies 4 years analytic training program at Child and Adolescent Treatment Program. She is currently working on a book of plays, Unsettled Villages, Witnessing the Evolution of the East and West Villages in New York City. She is in private practice practice as a psychotherapist in the East Village of New York City. So, Gabriela, it's your time, and you have well, a little more than 10 minutes. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for this rich conversation up to now. So I will read my few thoughts with the hope that this beautiful conversation will continue. Reading Jeffrey Rubin's thoughts, one may be inspired to approach them from so many perspectives, and I struggled trying to decide what triggered me the most. As a relational psychoanalytic therapist, I had to insert the word relationship in the title, a word used by the author in the phrase problematic relationship with his mother. There I found myself reading, thinking, and asking about the relationship of Freud with religion and women for the first time in a way I never did before while reading the paper. My immediate intention was to split the split domain into dyads and ask myself, what about the relationship of religion and women? Or to involve my subjectivity thinking of my relationship with Freud, religion, and women, since the author managed to make such a clear picture of Freud's relationship with religion and his mother. I was a Christian woman in love with Freud before I became a therapist. My faith was implanted into my soul when listening by my aunt, my father's sister, when she taught me my first prayer, my dear angel. I was 8 and religion became my safest hiding place. Years later, the priest I had at the time would advise me against psychology, saying, confession and the church are the only meaningful and accepted forms and places for the self-revelation of the mysterious depths of one's soul and mind. I was afraid of the divani and the laying therapy as that technique imposing on me passivity and submission, thus controlling me the way my mother always did. My family, my priest, my analyst requested obedience of me, and I felt confused, not realizing back then that indeed in therapy something out of the ordinary is happening, whenever bringing to consciousness hidden material of oneself, something sacred and so difficult for me years later to deal with as death, madness, mysticism, since as our author mentions, psychoanalysis neglects the sacred, and no training would prepare me for what followed. Does religion request for blind submission? Isn't the analytic frame asking for obedience from the analysand? What about the authority power of the God analyst? Ferenczi wrote in his clinical diary, religious people are selfless, in that they renounce to their own self. Primordial life is selfless because it does not possess a developed self as yet. Do not question, do not ask, just take in, as Freud was writing to Ferenczi. You want to learn more about human nature because you are ignorant, and I am here to teach you. An analysis is not a chivalrous affair between two equals, but you must learn to absorb things and not argue back. You must change this habit. As I was reading the paper, I got annoyed at some point, thinking, why does he care so much about what Freud did with religion because of his mother? Although I knew me and the entire world care about everything Freud said about everything for the last more than 100 years. I found the hypothesis of the unconscious linkage of religion and the maternal quite revolutionary, and still getting to the point of the paper where the writer says, there needs to be a closer encounter of a new kind between psychoanalysis and religion. I got my answer. He continues beautifully pointing, the task for the disciplines of psychoanalysis and religion, like the challenge for individuals in a committed relationship, is to balance autonomy and connectedness so that there is intimacy that preserves and enriches the autonomy of each, and I would add, even the subjective existence of each. Freud is the one saying only religion has an answer to the question of the purpose of life in civilization and in this context. And when talking about the common man and his religion, Freud quotes poetry saying, whoever possesses science and art also has religion. Whoever possesses neither of these, let him have religion. It is worthwhile mentioning that in Totem and Taboo, Freud makes a very deep analysis trying to, as he says, to throw light on the origins of the Totemian religion as the oldest form of religion to himself. And he continues with Christianity and other religions, placing religion as one of the 4 great cultural institutions of civilization, together with morality, justice, and philosophy. In my view, psychoanalysis as a discipline of the mind, the science of the unconscious mind, as Freud called it, next to religion, as a discipline of the soul, even of humanity, what Mircea Eliade called an irreducible category of human experience of history, it have a common point, and that is to contain and educate the human nature. According to Alan Porter, when Freud came to fame as the inventor of psychoanalysis in his early 40s, it was after having already an extensive set of publication and being considered a zoologist, neurologist, and physician. And in a letter to the editor of the Jewish Press Center in Zurich in 1925, Freud wrote, "I can say that I stand as far apart from the Jewish religion as from all other religions. That is to say, they are of great significance to me as a subject of scientific interest, but I have no part in them emotionally. On the other hand, I have always had a strong feeling of solidarity with my fellow people and have always encouraged it in my children as well. We have all remained in the Jewish denomination. In the time of my youth, our free-thinking religious instructors set no store by their pupils acquiring a knowledge of the Hebrew language and literature. My education in this field was therefore extremely behindhand, as I have since often regretted." According to this statement, I do not think Freud rejected religion, nor did he bury religion alive, as the author writes, but he was trying to understand this through a very thorough analysis. Unknown and complicated to him as his mother, probably, religion represented a point of interest for Freud, maybe with the purpose of giving a meaning to the absence of the maternal feeling in him. Our paper today is very rich, thought-provoking, and clear when explaining the relationship of psychoanalysis with religion. And as one goes through Freud writing, can find a lot of quotes like religion interferes with the display of selection and adaptation by forcing on everyone indiscriminately its own path to the attainment of happiness and protection from suffering. But then he said, not even religion can keep its promise of happiness, he means. The ultimate consolation and source of pleasure in the midst of suffering is unconditional submission. Thus talking about submission, guilt, the tendency to a displacement of psychical values, saying religion practice gradually became the essential thing and push aside the underlying thoughts. But what came to my mind was Leonardo da Vinci and the memory of his childhood from 1910, where Freud writes, "When everyone has, like Leonardo, escaped being intimidated by his father during his earliest childhood, and has in his researches cast away the fetters of authority, it would be in the sharpest contradiction to our expectation if we found that he had remained a believer and had been unable to escape from dogmatic religion. Psychoanalysis has made us familiar with the intimate connection between the father complex and belief in God. It has shown us that a personal God is psychologically nothing other than an exalted father. And it brings us evidence every day of how young people lose their religious beliefs as soon as their father's authority breaks down. Thus, we recognize that the roots of the need for religion are in the parental complex, the almighty and just God. And kindly nature appears to us as grand sublimation of father and mother, or rather as revivals and restoration of the young child's in ideas of them." End of quote. There we are reminded of the episode most of us know, and Jeffrey mentioned it before, most of us known when he felt ashamed by a father who did not retaliate after his head was knocked off in an anti-Semitic incident. The family of Freud was non-practicing Jews living in an anti-Semitic society. So what was left there for Freud, except a weak father, a too young and busy mother, and a big rivalry with his many brothers and sisters? No room for relationships and feelings, just science as a soothing God, giving him purpose and a reason of living. I want to skip some. In the abstract of the paper, our author writes, "Religion enjoys a problematic standing in psychoanalysis. But I say, so does women, in both religion and psychoanalysis, a common point where the two disciplines seems to agree." He also writes, "Religion has been pathologized and marginalized by psychoanalysis, but so did women. For the purpose of making psychoanalysis a science, Freud uses his women clients as examples. He reveals information from their sessions to their husbands. He makes a show from their suffering. He idolizes his mother in a way religion idolizes Virgin Mary, the way we tend to idealize the unreachable. The author reminds us of Freud's opinion, the mother-son relationship is altogether the most perfect, the most free from ambivalence of all human relationships. Jeffrey mentioned it before. But we can say the same thing about our relationship with religion. There is no ambivalence in being a believer. One is or one is not. There is either in or out. On the other hand, what can a 21-year-old woman who married a man who would be her father and immediately after her first newborn, Freud, gets pregnant and loses a child and then becomes the mother of other 6 children, offer him? And what is the place of a child growing up in a house with the father's biggest sons and their children? And yet he is the one saying the following about Ferenczi. You cannot understand Ferenczi's method without understanding his whole history. He was one of 11 children. His mother was intelligent and efficient, but naturally she could not give this child much love. He could not be singled out. He was starved for love. That was his secret, which came out when he was analyzed by me. Ferenczi tried to...
1 minute.
Okay. As a woman, my life was marked by my father, God, and Freud, and yet my mother is the one I'm fighting with still. The author writes, Freud was imprisoned by his relationship with his mother, but who isn't? All relationships are imprisonment. The difference is on the material of the frame, bars of their elasticity. We all know neither religion nor psychoanalysis possesses this quality. It is important to point out, I think, that Freud had a long list of relationships with women, as Ferenczi did, as analyst, and men, of course. But when Ferenczi proposed the mutual analysis, accepting to give up on all resistance in favor of one of his clients' therapeutic outcome, a woman, Elizabeth Severn, Freud commented Ferenczi and called Severn an evil genius.
Thank you.
Psychoanalysis and religion, just one phrase, psychoanalysis and religion have been through many wars and splitting. They are indeed human experience in time. I really do not know if a new meeting point is possible, and I do not know if they ever met since Freud tried to understand religion, but religion stands above us all. Lately, politics and modern sciences took over and humanity got lost. Even nature dies around us. We have no place to hide anymore. The worms of the world are so devastated by the human destructiveness, there is nothing left. Death is everywhere, and life is fighting to survive. There is no immunity by destruction. What I think is possible, though, and it is happening, is maybe both psychoanalysis and religion revise their position of women. What if women are the meeting point of both psychoanalysis and religion? Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Gabriela. So we'll give the floor to Teresa. If you want to proceed, you have 10 minutes.
I'm unmuting myself. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
All right, very good. First of all, I would like to salute you, Dr. Rubin. That was a wonderful and thought-provoking paper. And my comments really are like riffs on the ideas that you've presented rather than critique. So unfortunately, I'm also right on narrativist theories, so I do a few segues out into outer space, but that's me. I almost wanted to subtitle this, it was a quote from Nietzsche, maybe what you were citing before, Trevor, that all theory is autobiography. It's actually Paul Valéry, his friend, and I think it somehow gets appropriated by Nietzsche or taken by, who knows. But I think all of us were compelled to become, those of us who became psychoanalysts, by some deeply subjective strand of what we read about Freud, saw about Freud. I saw a movie once when I was a kid, John Huston made. I thought this was a great thing. And yeah, so that said, I am following certain threads. So I'm going to really just address certain points that I was interested in and excited by in the paper. And I'll have to skip around so I make sure I get my ideas in, since there's probably more there. But one of my comments is that religion at its very worst can be seen as a legitimization of power and aggression. Most religions typically endow male figures, power signifiers in the symbolic registers, I think the Lacanians would say, with the power to guide, teach, and in some cases to absolve and to judge. This is true of religious practitioners in power, I'd say, and probably from many other religions. And just as a disclaimer, I was raised as a Roman Catholic. For a long time as a child, I had fantasies about entering a convent and would send away for applications, and they would tell me right back when you're 18, and your permission, or something like that. But it was a religion that for me was infused with mysticism and a kind of fantastical beauty of the afterlife. Okay, so that was the first illusion in my life, but I think illusions are deeply important to all of us, and one could say that our belief in psychoanalysis is an illusion too. I'm sure somebody's going to shoot it down. I'm an academic, and they do this all day long. I mean, it's questioning your ideas. Dr. Rubin makes a reference to a compelling idea that for most of us trained in psychoanalysis took the place of religious belief, quoting Freud a little bit, been smuggled into psychoanalysis, as Freud jokes. It's very worse. The earliest classical training, and this is just very subjective on my part, became a rigid burden for many of us, both in thought and in practice. When I was writing my dissertation, I had the chance to interview many analysts, some trained in Germany and Austria, maybe third rung down from Freud, probably. They described a problematic lack of discussing the implications of theoretical ideas and were discouraged to do so. In other words, of thinking about the implications of an idea. What are the implications of an ego psychology? What are the implications of the unconscious? Something like that. And years ago, I was teaching PhD students in a very psychoanalytically friendly program that we had at NYU many years ago. And my students exemplified this. Many of them were analytically trained, much more classical actually, and had an inability to think of any aspect of psychoanalytic theory utilizing even a small degree of critical thinking in deconstructing Freud's ideas. It was as if they couldn't do it. It was almost like an assault on their very being. So the students saw critique as political, even though I'm an analyst myself. And I said, I'm on your side, but we do this in academic life, and you're doing this program, and you want to think critically. Your mind is the freest thing about you, but it actually wasn't. Enormous fights between sometimes the object relations supporters and the self-psychologists. There was blood on the floor sometimes about these fights even, and people got so subjectively dedicated to their theoretical ideas that they almost couldn't think straight, So, okay, I was talking at one point about, I'm sorry, is this backing up in the,
No, somebody has the mic on. I will identify the person.
All right, thank you. Okay. I was joking when I was teaching that when I first began analytic treatment and I questioned an intervention or a comment I made to a patient, I would ask myself, was this a mortal or a venial sin? In other words, if it's a mortal sin for a Catholic, you're condemned to hell forever. There's no getting out of this unless you got to a confessor first, like the ancient popes did, If it was a venial sin, you could get forgiven, but you're going to spend some time in hell while you're at it, and then you could go on. So it had that quality for me as well. This is important because psychoanalysis can give the illusion of a quest for finding a great truth that results in total unquestioning belief. Something like believing, questioning gravity, let's say the force of gravity itself. There was a famous fight that took place in the academy, by the way, about this between the postmoderns and the scientists. It was a wonderful, it ended up as a conference too. Somebody said he invited anybody who didn't believe in gravity to jump out of the window of his 23rd story office and see if it didn't exist. So, okay. For me, theory, when it's postulated as a science or even as a quest for science, it's problematic. I see it more as a form of social theory, as Stephen Mitchell has suggested. And similarly to religion, psychoanalysis in the most classical forms could also be used to legitimize power and aggression in interpretation in clinical practice and theory. This is something I think we all have to own. when we do this work. Freud, there's a quality that he has of wanting to see a truth in psychoanalysis. I want to say that rather than a wish fulfillment, that he's created a science. The language of psychoanalysis, initially anyway, had the quality of the language of the patriarchy. This has been critiqued by the second wave theorists, notably Kristeva, Irigaray, and many others, as a patriarchal style of language in the academy. And in psychoanalysis, I mean, but also in the academy, because for a long time, you couldn't use the word I in a dissertation, for example. You had to say, this reporter said, or this observer said. Now you can use the word I, by the way, but yeah, there was a lot of arguing about this. So now I'm going to move on to some comments about women. Strangely, despite the banishment of Jung, Adler, God knows how many more men, women held a strange, I think, and somewhat exalted position in the psychoanalytic world. And I don't know of any women who were expelled from psychoanalysis under Freud's time. I'd be curious to know if there were any, and I'd like to hear about that. Some may have left of their own accord, but many of the women of Freud's that were first patients and then practitioners under Freud's tutelage, Lou Andrea Salome, Helena Deutsch, Marina Bonaparte, and his own daughter Anna herself were important, became very important figures to him. Andrea Salome is interesting because she was a close friend and a valuable advisor to Freud, including giving her advice to Freud about his raising of his daughter, Anna. Anna herself salutes her and says that she was a great mentor and friend, not her analyst, but she helped her to become the person she wanted to be. There's somewhere I read this, and it's very distressing to me that Freud discouraged Anna from going to medical school and even from going to college.
Teresa, you have 1 minute left.
Oh, brother. Okay. Well, then I'm really going to jump ahead. Okay. What I'm moving towards is a position of what I see as a kind of splitting between women who were almost sacred and profane, that he has as an adult a collection of women who are cerebral and thinking, and they're allowed to speak what they want to speak. But there's this other side, which I attribute to the experience of the nanny that Dr. Rubin makes mention of, describes a horrific experience. I interpret it as a Fairbairnian, in Fairbairnian language, actually, the kind of bad exciting or bad rejecting object as a form of splitting and projection of certain kinds of women. And then another kind of experience. And what I did, since I only have a minute, I can't do it justice, is to describe from a paper by a classicist on Freud and the time he spends in Italy, where he is ecstatic, essentially, about Italy. He talks about it as if Italy embodies a woman. He talks about it in very sensual language, the sense of smell, the beauty of the women of Rome, even, he says, the ugly women. This is a quote. So even the painted women, that's another part of the quote, even they are beautiful. So they're like creatures that he invents. I go on to say,
can you end with that?
I'm gonna end with it, that this is a form of it's a critical philosophy, a form of what is called Sehnsucht outside of psychoanalysis. It means an attachment or an obsession with something, an addiction, but also a nostalgia for a place you've never been. And this place is a total conjuring, because I've been to Italy a million times and it's never the same. And I couldn't tell you who these people were, and I was born to some of them, so.
Thank you.
That's it. Okay.
Thanks very much. Sorry for the short time.
No, it's all right.
Okay, so thanks, Teresa. Thanks, Gabriella, too. And now we'll have 5 minutes for Jeffrey to respond to your respondents.
Oh,
unmute, please.
Sorry. Thank you. Thank you, Gabriella and Teresa, so much. I'm going to do my best to do respond to each of you, but if I don't, maybe in the Q&A, we can bounce back because it's going to be hard in 5 minutes. I had the weirdest experience with Gabriella's paper, which is that I read it several times and I had nothing to say. I had a blank mind. I didn't actually have nothing to say. I had a few ideas that I felt that you brought yourself. I was really glad you brought yourself in. I was really glad you dialogued with my paper in terms of your own life. But then I was somewhat blank after that. And then when I listened to you, and I worried about that, and I was nervous about that. And then when I listened to you now, it evoked a whole set of things, and I heard the paper in a completely different way. So I want to suggest that something about that process is important to the topic today and psychoanalysis in general and living, which is to take seriously Freud and Jung's ideas, back to Brian and my discussion, Freud and Jung's idea about the unconscious. The unconscious is the not, what we're not aware of, not what we're aware of. So as I listened to you just now and just kind of free associated, I went from blankness and nervousness to a whole set of things were evoked. So I want to just share a little bit about that. So thank you. So number one, obedience. And then you said soon after that, sacred. I thought there was something sacred about you pointing out the secret obedience in psychoanalysis, because that can lead not to something sacred, but to the subjectivity of the person being left out, annihilated, missed, left out. So thank you. Then you talked about neglecting the sacred. One of the interesting things was that nobody else picked up on that, but that's where I ended up at the end of the paper, that I tried to work through Freud and this relationship with his mother and psychoanalysis, as reducing of religion, to get to a contemplative psychoanalysis that might be open to the sacred. So I want to thank you for seeing something in there that was important to me, and I felt we were not engaging or talking about in any discussion. So thank you. You also did the same thing when you talked about a close encounter of a new kind. That's exactly what I wanted to do. But you see, that has a different lightness about it, aliveness and spirit, than these polarized binary discussions about science and religion and is one all this illusion. You see, it's all, to me, male theorizing. And there was something as a woman with you bringing in your experience and subjectivity that you engaged the paper in a more intimate way. And I was very, very grateful for that. And then you talked about, at the end, intimacy and autonomy. And then you added, which I love, subjectivity. So there may be something really deep in that about using the model of a healthy relationship to look at how we look at these topics and whether we could have an intimate relationship with thinking about psychoanalysis and science and psychoanalysis and religion, an intimate relationship that respects the autonomy of each different way of human knowing and being, and doesn't lose the subjectivity of any of them. So thank you for that unconscious prompt, Gabriella, because it got me to be able to say that. Okay. And then I finally heard what you said in a different way, even though it was probably screaming in your earlier drafts about women like religion and have a problematic relationship in psychoanalysis. So that might be a whole other conference or a whole other paper that you will write about that. But I think we need to keep that question alive. As Rilke says, live the questions, live them now, and one day we may live ourselves into the answer. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I think that's okay. Teresa, thank you for the courageous act of playing with my presentation. In your spirit, I'm going to take the lead and sort of join your dance and kind of dance with you a little bit. I had a similar kind of experience that I had with Teresa, which at first I thought I didn't have a lot to say, which I intellectually rationalized as, well, Teresa's free associating to the paper, and a lot of her free associations are going outside the paper. So I don't have that much to say because it's not about the paper. But I heard it differently, again, as I did with Gabriella, when I listened to you just now instead of read the paper and discovered myself or something when I was reading the paper. So thank you. And what I heard was an importance of the rigidity in students of psychoanalysis, how sad, how important we try to understand that, how important we try to counter that fear and rigidity in training that molds people and doesn't bring out their uniqueness or their subjectivity or their another word we haven't used today, their creativity. Then you said they couldn't think straight. And I've been influenced recently by a newly developing relationship with Howard Stein, who I now think of as a friend. And I listened in a way Howard might. They couldn't think straight. Usually we go right past that comment. And we think it means, I think, they can't think clearly. We're kind of confused, muddled, flooded with feelings. But I was Howardish for a second, for a blessed moment. And I thought, can't think straight. And then I thought, thinking straight, what's that? That might be linear, but that can be limited. And so I wondered if in their not being able to think straight, there would be a moment if they could meditatively embrace and analytically embrace that. In other words, be curious about that, where some new dimension could unfold and reveal itself. With the students who are caught in the rigidity, caught obedient, to use Gabriella's terms, in this place of obedience, whether underneath that there's something, or around that or above that, something else is possible.
Okay, Jeffrey, would you like to leave the rest for the discussion? Your time is out.
Let me
Okay.
say one more thing if I can.
Of course.
I'll do it really quickly. I had other things, but let me say one more. So, Teresa, when you free associated to Rome, where I went was in Freud's discussion of Rome, which I agree with you is multi-layered and really interesting. In Civilization as Discontents, he says that think of the self like a city, like Rome. And I wrote a paper that's going to be in a book that Ken is editing. The other Ken is editing on Freud and other matters, to talk about the self as city. I think it's a vision that Freud offered there. That's a really radical, interesting vision of the self. It's a place with multiple neighborhoods, clashing, beautiful sights. You could start playing with what if the self was a city. And I got that from Freud's Reflections on Rome. So thank you for the reminder about Rome.
Thank you, Jeffrey. So we have now time for a general discussion. Jeffrey, the last word is for you.
Yes. Brian asked me the other day, how are you feeling about the meeting? And I was not in a not in a great space about it, which I told him. And but Karen's comment, it's been a wonderful experience, and I thank all of you. Karen's comment is exactly what I hoped would happen. Karen, your comment about big space, that's what I was hoping for, that the dialogue, my presentation and the conversation and the back and forth and the disagreements and the challenges would lead for all of us to sort of inhabit a bigger space, to engage these three forces, women, psychoanalysis, psychoanalysis, science, women, religion, in a more open-spirited way. So that makes me feel the whole thing was a huge success. Just, Charlotte, a quick question, a quick comment. See, I would argue that where the religion, I know something Trevor maybe had trouble with me when I said that, religion smuggled in, religion smuggled into science sometimes. This is exactly what I meant. You see, I think there's no accident that he was interested in telepathy. I think the too quick rejection of religion because of one force that he didn't fully understand, one force, the maternal, but he still had something that was unworked out, and then it turned towards telepathy and mind reading and can people read my thoughts? I think it was stuff about boundaries and boundaries that were too open, that were scary. I would argue they're related, actually, to my whole argument.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. So if I may close this conference, we had more than half an hour general discussion, and I warm-heartedly thank everyone for participation, listening, and of course, all of you presenters today. And maybe this will continue in some workshop on Freud psychobiography, something like that. So it is a suggestion for me to any person interested. And I don't know if our president wants to say something to close. Brian?
I just want to note that the International Psychohistorical Association has a monthly salon, which is an unstructured opportunity for academics and clinicians from all over the world to across multiple time zones to just break bread and talk, figuratively speaking. And our next one is going to be on October 1st at 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And so if you enjoyed this, we have a lot of programming. You'll be on our mailing list. The next one is Jeffrey's going to do something on Shakespeare. It just so happens that Jeffrey is doing 2 of these in a row, but the next one is going to be on Shakespeare. When is that, Ina?
The 30th of September.
Okay.
And I will include the information with the follow-up email.
Yeah, so you'll get a follow-up email. Just be aware that there are multiple ways of connecting to our community and experiencing more of what you heard today. Thank you.